One ninja-like announcement snuck into the April Nintendo Direct. Literally in the small print was the renaming of the old consoles on Nintendo Switch Online to Nintendo Classics. Nintendo Switch Online Classic game libraries are being renamed to Nintendo Classics, is what the small print actually says. In itself, this is just a bit of branding and it doesn't really necessarily signify an awful lot. But I do think that there are a few aspects to all this that are very curious. First of all, note that there is a continuity now with the style of the Nintendo Music app and Nintendo Today. They clearly want the simplicity of having their corporate name and just the one identifier after, and that's fair enough. Nintendo Classics is a far more intuitive name for these classic consoles. But what's curious is that it's no longer tied to Nintendo Switch Online. My theory for a while has been that long term, and I'm talking probably years, not months, they may want to open up an even more widely accessible tier for Nintendo Switch Online membership, which is not tied to the system but could be operated on smartphones. Having a Nintendo Classics app that can operate just a few simple games might be a great starting point for them, and Payton suggests that they have at least considered on-screen controls that would suit touchscreen gaming, though this doesn't necessarily mean they'll implement them, of course. Currently, the base tier has NES, SNES, and Game Boy, while the expansion pack has Nintendo 64, Game Boy Advance, and GameCube. We'll talk Sega in a second. I feel like 3 consoles per tier works quite well for them, but of course there are many more consoles which also have potential. Wii and DS are probably the most plausible in the years ahead. Emulating the Wii would be memory intensive, but we saw Super Mario Galaxy on Super Mario 3D All-Stars, so presumably it is possible, and it would be a prestige system to add to Nintendo's back catalogue. The DS is a trickier one, but with that top USB, it seems completely plausible to ultimately look to sell a second screen to clip on and allow these games to be played as they always were meant to be played, with a second screen. The logistics of this are trickier though, as the different screen sizes might look quite ridiculous. Nintendo is very keen, for obvious reasons, for there to be equal treatment for docked, handheld, and tabletop mode. In this sense, there is no obvious future-proofing to facilitate the arrival of the Nintendo DS onto Nintendo Classics, but that's not to say it won't happen. On television mode, the only real option would be to have the screen vertical, which means black bars either side. Mouse mode facilitates the touchscreen activities, so it would be playable. It just wouldn't take up much screen real estate, but I imagine they could build in options at a software level so that you could drag the two screens around or potentially have them side by side. This would also presumably be how tabletop mode would work. For handheld mode, the obvious solution for DS seems to be missed by Nintendo in terms of their design for the new system this time out, and that is vertical play. There is no apparent functionality for a vertical gameplay style being supported in the Switch 2 as presented. No sign that the kickstand tilts to allow it to stand up vertically, for example. In one respect, given the way that Nintendo is welcoming so many other playstyles through the mouse mode and with the microphone and camera, this does seem to me like a slightly odd oversight. Since the dawn of the mobile phone era, vertical play has become far more commonplace, and TikTok seems to have led to an embrace of the vertical format in other contexts as well. There are also plenty of titles that just make sense, played vertically. Tetris, for example. My sense is that they want at all costs to discourage developers from using a format that so disadvantages tabletop and television players, and in any event puts the Switch 2 in a stress position which might not be beneficial for the long-term health of the consoles. I mean, in theory, you could put the Switch 2 into vertical mode just by tilting your machine and you could play with one Joy-Con. This is doable even on Switch, but the Switch 2 is a good bit heavier, reportedly 534 grams compared to Switch OLED's 319 grams. Those magnets are reportedly pretty strong, with people able to hold the console by one Joy-Con, but I'm not sure it would survive hours of play in that form factor. Instead, I think to facilitate DS play on a handheld basis, Nintendo will need to sell special Joy-Con that clips to what would now be the bottom of the screen, and which would contain a D-pad, buttons, and the ability to access shoulder buttons, which is the main thing holding back the existing Joy-Con from supporting the DS effectively. This would still be pretty weird, but then the DS was always a quirky machine, so perhaps this kind of approach would work for them. I don't know how many expansion pack members won't have a Switch 2 within the first 2 or 3 years, but around this time might be an optimal moment for them to bring some other expansion pack titles, probably N64 and Mega Drive, down to the base tier of Nintendo Switch Online, and then perhaps export maybe Game Boy or NES to mobile devices. If they do this any sooner, expansion pack members will be disadvantaged too badly from not having the Switch 2, and it may cause people to drop off the service entirely, but they can watch these numbers and move at a time that feels most appropriate for them. I guess the question here is whether any wilder console types could appear. Virtual Boy and 3DS are both interesting because they both support 3D. Nintendo doesn't need to support the exact original form factors, of course. Sure, they could sell classic controllers, but it's not like you need to use them. But it strikes me that you have an ideal base tier and higher tier console if at some point they developed something that could use stereoscopic 3D, probably something in the VR sphere, as an optional add-on. Even if they do a Labo-style headset accessory, I don't see this being a major plank of Switch 2's offering though, and so either they could sit on this until a form factor that would benefit these classic consoles come along, or they could just go ahead sooner and not bother about trying to emulate the specific appearances of these devices. Virtual Boy strikes me as an especially useful console in this respect, as although it's pretty niche, it is exciting and different enough to make a bit of a splash and could flesh out that middle tier, which is currently the base tier. It strikes me that Nintendo's endgame for Switch 2 a decade from now could be something like having the NES, Game Boy, and Super NES on the Classics app for smart devices, then N64, Virtual Boy, and Game Boy Advance on the base tier, which is currently the main Nintendo Switch Online offering, and then Wii, DS, and GameCube on the expansion pack. Potentially then 3DS and Wii U could be saved for another day. Where, though, does this leave the Sega console, the Mega Drive or Genesis? As someone who grew up playing Mega Drive and still has a lot of nostalgic attachment to Sega's glory days, I would love to see Sega go all in with the Nintendo classics, although I'm not sure that this is particularly likely. The current branding looks frankly very odd, with Nintendo Classics having its own brand and the Mega Drive just being stuck in the old Nintendo Switch Online app format. It feels like Nintendo have made Sega an afterthought, and I wonder how Sega would feel about that. However, I don't think they will mind too much if A, they have their own plans for their classic games, which is possible, but I wonder if they could really find a better venue for promoting their classic wares than the Switch 2 with its potentially vast install base. Or B, if they plan their own Sega Classics app within the Nintendo Switch Online. It would make sense after all. Now the list of apps available with Nintendo Switch Online would be Nintendo Classics, Sega Classics, and Nintendo Music. Neat, clean, and of course this would allow Sega to have a three-tier approach themselves. The Sega consoles are more difficult though. The Master System and Game Gear are essentially the same in many ways, except that the Game Gear versions tend not to show as much of the screen, making some of the games that appeared on both actually far harder to play in their Game Gear versions. It would take some work, therefore, to figure out which of these versions would be best to incorporate, and judging by Sonic Origins, Sega isn't really too concerned about sweating the details of that. It does strike me that Master System and Game Gear would make a great base tier though. Then for the middle tier we have the Mega Drive, but with the Mega CD and 32X jazzing it up, and there's still a lot more that could be added in terms of the 16-bit era consoles. Then on the top tier, we have the dearly departed Dreamcast, which could be a huge console to add to Nintendo Switch Online at some point in the next generation, especially given the Dreamcast's now near mythic status in the nostalgic gaming community. The chance to sell Dreamcast controllers would be awesome, but what would really be amazing is if they made the VMU memory card still. They were an absolutely awesome innovation, if only so that you could play Chow games on Sonic Adventure. One thing in favour of Dreamcast on Switch 2 in the medium term is the astonishing non-re-emergence of the adventure games. They have remastered a bunch of old Sonics in recent years, but despite the fact that the third Sonic movie appears to have cribbed huge chunks from Sonic Adventure 2, that game has curiously not returned. Maybe they're gearing up for a Sonic Adventure 2 battle on the Nintendo Classics app, but if Sega had designs on a Dreamcast app of their own, then Sonic Adventure would be their Wind Waker. Of course, the question is, would Sega want to throw in with Nintendo when they can sell all of these games separately? My hunch is that even if they just attach themselves to Nintendo for a limited time and withdraw this in the future when they're ready to move on, they will expand their audience base so significantly, and that's the key thing that they need right now. It's all very well to have a strategy of cracking Hollywood and capitalizing on their past IP, but that's of absolutely no use if nobody has a clue who Shinobi is, or who Vector Man is, and what is a Street of Rage anyway. Getting these games in front of new fans and at least having the name recognition is going to be key to that strategy, and the prestige of having Dreamcast alongside GameCube on Nintendo hardware might be worth it if it becomes a beloved classic console for a new generation. Now, the console I've left out from consideration is, of course, the Sega Saturn. I absolutely adore the Saturn, and while I can no longer deny that the Switch has become my favourite console of all time, before that it would easily have been the Sega Saturn. The Wii U of its age, it messed up everything, but it has a library brimming with the best games that nobody has ever played, a library that, pound for pound, I still maintain, demolishes the PlayStations. It's notoriously hard to emulate, but Switch emulation has been seen for Saturn games at times. The trouble is, I don't think a sufficient mass of people is desperate enough to play Shining Force 3, Baku Baku Animal, Dark Savior, Fighters Megamix, Virtual On, Guardian Heroes, or even Nights into Dreams. I'm not sure either Sega or Nintendo would consider the juice to be worth the squeeze, which is heartbreaking to me, but perhaps in the future something will change. Still, it's not completely impossible. The Saturn was far more successful in Japan than the West, and the Dreamcast was less successful. While Sega seems generally to pivot towards America and the West, Nintendo is very mindful of its Japanese audience, and in that demographic there is a far stronger chance that a Saturn NSO app would hold some appeal. It's also possible that machine translation could ultimately open up an absolutely massive library of Japan exclusive Saturn games to the West for the first time. Anytime I mention AI, people assume I'm advocating for it, and I would obviously prefer dedicated translations with love and care, but realistically, Sega are never going to spend that kind of money. But if they can find a way to cheaply and efficiently brute force their way to do the bulk of translation work, leaving only some testing and bug fixing to adjust for window sizes, that seemed like something that they might go for. And there are many games that truly deserve to be better known. An amazing fan translation team brought all three parts of Shining Force 3 to English speakers, but this is a truly landmark title in gaming history, and Nintendo's partners at Camelot Software Planning would doubtless be supportive of such an effort, given that the poor treatment of Shining Force 3 seems to have been one of the precipitating factors that made them leave Sega for Nintendo all those years ago. Therefore, I do think that there is a tiny spark of hope, slim though it may be. Now, I haven't mentioned some other possibilities, although they are much more obscure. Satellaview and 64DD are obvious potential add-ons to the Super NES and Nintendo 64 classic apps, and could probably be put on their feet even within the existing app. In the medium term, I can't see there being any particular interest in doing this, though. In fact, the recent Yoshio Sakamoto interview concerning Famicom Detective Club didn't seem to even mention the Satellaview title at all. But ultimately, I think the Classics moniker must also reflect the fact that they realize that this is their legacy, and as the library fills out, they may wish to be able to leverage all parts of it. Quite apart from anything else, they will eventually run out of cool stuff to add, and so it suits them to have a few surprises still up their sleeve. It's been 2 years since the last new console before GameCube, and I feel like 70% to 30% we don't get anything of substance added to Nintendo Classics until after summer of 2026. But Once the expansion pack players are on Switch 2, then I can see Nintendo starting to fatten up both tiers in anticipation of starting a new accessible app. And so, before 2029, I give the chances right now as 30% for Virtual Boy, 50% for Wii, and 70% for DS. As for the Sega consoles, another Sega console before 2029 feels to me like a 50% chance, if only the Mega CD and or 32X, so that Sega can put Sonic CD and Knuckles Chaotix onto the NSO app, but it could equally go the other direction, and they pull the Sega app entirely if it's not really working out for the companies, and if Sega are ready to embrace their own technologies. That's it for now, but please do get into the comments section and start the campaign to get Sega Saturn onto Nintendo Switch Online. Thank you so much for liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing. Thank you particularly to the channel's Patreon supporters, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.